Hey guys, I just watched Killers of the Flower Moon, latest Scorsese flick, collaboration with Apple TV and Paramount Pictures. I've been following this film for quite a while because I'm a Scorsese fan. I've seen most of his movies, I think. I haven't seen all of them, but I'm a big fan of Martin Scorsese, so I was really hyped for this movie. Not only that, but I would say Scorsese's at the height of his game, which I don't know how. The man's almost 80 years old, but his movies haven't slowed down. There was a period in the 2000s, I would say his movies were kind of mediocre when The Aviator and Gangs of New York were coming out. Those were like lesser Scorsese movies to me, but lately he's been on a roll with Wolf of Wall Street, The Silence, The Irishman, and now Killers of the Flower Moon. I like this moment in Scorsese's filmography. I just feel like he's like hitting home runs left and right and just doing whatever he wants. Not only that, but this was quite a interesting topic of conversation because this was a $200 million movie. That's right, Apple just said, Scorsese, here's $200 million. Go do what you want. And on its surface, it does not look like a $200 million movie, because nowadays when we think 200 million, we think of Fast and Furious and the Avengers movies. But the money does show in this movie. For one, the story takes place in Oklahoma, and they wanted to film in Oklahoma, which was very important and definitely shows in the final product. So instead of going in a place that's very incentivizing for taxes, they decided to film in Oklahoma. Not only that, but you have big name stars in this movie. Not only Leonardo DiCaprio and Robert De Niro, who are both big name talents, but you also have a great supporting cast. You have Brendan Fraser, fresh off of his Oscar. You have John Lithgow, Jesse Plemons, and this newcomer here, Lily Gladstone, who everyone is talking about as being like the standout in the film. I remember when hearing about this movie, when it first got announced, it was going to be more centered around the FBI. I remember when the IMDb synopsis kind of came out, it was talking about like the first days of the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover creating the FBI. And this isn't what the movie is about. The focus kind of shifted from the FBI to Leonardo DiCaprio's character of this man who's a World War I veteran, just comes back home and works for his uncle and falls in love with a Native American woman. And when that concept first came out, I was kind of afraid. Not that I didn't trust Scorsese, I always do, and Scorsese we trust, but it was more of I was scared it was going to be another Dances with Wolves, which is a movie I'm not really fond of, to be quite honest. But I think it's ultimately a move that paid off because while I think the FBI moments are kind of dry and dull, I do think the love story is really what stands out in this movie because it's not your traditional love story. Neither is this very your traditional Scorsese movie. In many senses, I was reminded of The Irishman that came out last year, but in other ways, this is a very unique Scorsese movie. Scorsese's movies are mostly about glorifying violence and the heightened reality of the world of crime, but this one kind of has more of a sense of justice and disgust as what's being portrayed in this movie. Like I said, this movie is $200 million. It's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. The cinematography, the opening shot of the Native Americans discovering oil and it's just exploding and they're dancing in it in slow motion while that beautiful music plays. By the way, the music in this movie is very beautiful. It was done by Robbie Robertson of the band, who I didn't know but does have Native American ancestry, and most of us know him from being in the band, so he's really good at doing blues guitar and bluegrass kind of music, and he kind of meshes those two genres together because that's the point of the movie. It's a movie about the Western world kind of colonizing the Native American world. The set design is beautiful. They really created a town in this movie. Sometimes Scorsese movies have questionable CGI. We saw that with The Irishman, but we also see that in movies like The Aviator and other movies like that. I feel like CG is always like a point of contention whenever a Scorsese movie comes out. whatever they did in this movie, there might have been a lot of digital trickery. I'm assuming there was. It was seamless in this movie. So kudos to that. And the costumes. I think this is going to be the movie that probably gets a lot of the technical awards at the Oscars for production design, costume, makeup, maybe not makeup, but all those kinds of awards. I can see Killers of the Flower Moon being nominated for those. As for the story itself, I've talked enough about the things surrounding the story. This is a really compelling story, and I can see why Scorsese shifted the focus from the FBI to this love story that's going on, because it really is a fascinating dissection. It's basically a dissection on how ignorance leads to violence, because when we're introduced to DiCaprio's character, he's a very ignorant character. He doesn't seem like a very bright person. Kind of comes across as a bit hickish as well. And the town he decides to settle in is the town where his uncle resides, played by Robert De Niro. And there's a very beautiful relationship between the Europeans and the Native Americans. Everything seems fine at first. People get along with one another, and as the movie progresses, the relationship between the two tribes kind of becomes more heated, and there's something very discomforting and kind of stressful about that. You're kind of just waiting for this ticking time bomb to go off. And I like how the town is as much a character in the story as DiCaprio, because when you see this town at first, you see very striking imagery of Native Americans who are living very lavish lifestyles, which is something that history doesn't really teach us. But then you see where the corruption comes in, and slowly you see this kind of merger of European style and Native American style all of a sudden become more European. I think of that scene where there's this fair going on and people are just shooting at a bell. And it started off very peaceful. There's a lot of Native American imagery. Also, when the first funeral takes place, there's a lot of Native American rituals going on. But as the film progresses, you kind of lose that Native American stuff, which is intentional. It's what makes the movie so unique. It's you feel the culture slowly dying in this environment. And DiCaprio's story in this movie is very similar to Mean Streets or Irishman, where you have one man who's torn between two people that he cares for very much. On the one hand, there's his wife, he loves her, and then there's the uncle who slowly starts corrupting his brain. Kind of reminded me of Robert De Niro's character in The Irishman, where he has these two friends, Joe Pesci and Al Pacino, and they both have conflicting ideologies, and he's just caught in the middle of it, and he's a bit more naive and just trying to make everyone happy. This is a very layered story. With a 3.5-hour runtime, I would expect it to be quite layered, especially for a Scorsese movie. And I think because it's so layered, you don't really feel its runtime. I did not feel like this was a 3.5 hour long movie. I didn't get bored really at any parts except towards the end, but I'll get into that later. Overall, there's just something always going on. It has a very quick pace, so you never really feel its runtime. And by the end of the movie, you feel like you breathe and you're okay, I just witnessed someone's life, which is something I really like about Scorsese's movies. They're not really about a story or a moment in time. They're more about a person's life, and you're kind of just following this person's life from beginning to end. And that picture that Scorsese paints in this movie is especially disturbing. Whereas in Goodfellas and Casino, you kind of have this glorification of what it's like working for the mob, and there's kind of this romanticized view of what the mob is. The way crime is depicted in this movie is not like other Scorsese movies, where it's portrayed as something very gross and disgusting and vile, and the crimes and atrocities that are committed by De Niro and DiCaprio's character, it really does make you uncomfortable, which is the point of the movie. I really felt disgust towards these two protagonists, and at the same time I really felt nothing but the utmost pity for Lily Gladstone's character. One scene in specific where I think really was a gut punch was, I'm just going to get into spoilers, just in case. But basically, the premise of the movie is that DiCaprio and De Niro are conspiring to kill Lily Gladstone's family because they have a lot of money, and DiCaprio's married to Lily Gladstone. So if everyone dies, all of a sudden the wealth comes to DiCaprio. And so slowly this woman's family dies one by random murders. And when the last sister dies, the only fucking family that this woman had left, when she dies, it's such a fucking gut punch of a moment, that scene, where you just feel like, oh my god, they're still fucking going. And that's what this movie is really good at. It's like, it starts off small and then gradually builds and builds and builds to the point where you're just like, when is this torture ever going to stop? Well, the movie does have that very quick pace that I like about a Scorsese movie. It does sometimes stop and lets you breathe in the atmosphere of the film, lets you breathe in the culture of the Osage natives. The one scene in particular that does that is when the mother passes away. And it's just like this beautifully drawn out scene where her ancestors come to visit her and she just walks away with her ancestors. The movie does do that quite often, kind of blend reality with the spiritual, which I did really like a lot about this movie. And it's something that I don't really see Scorsese do as often. He does it in movies like Last Temptation of Christ, but I feel like as of late, that kind of merger between the spiritual and the reality, it's not something he's done very often, so it was really beautiful when he did do it. It does follow a similar structure to other Scorsese movies. More of the tone and the feel and the emotions that are provoked are quite different. But the one scene that totally works in this movie is one that I've seen in other Scorsese movies, is like the point of no return scene, where, for example, in Goodfellas, when they're burying the body and there's the red lights from the car beaming onto Joe Pesci and Ray Liotta. That's kind of like a very striking visual. There's a scene in this movie where they're burning crops because there's insurance on the crops and De Niro wants the insurance money. And it's just like you feel like this character is in the pits of hell because there's fire all around them. Lily Gladstone's character is very ill and everything is sweaty. They're playing that blues song, Dark was the night, and they're just looping that over and over again. And the cinematography in that scene especially was very beautiful, and you really feel like this character is entering the gates of hell. It reminded me as well of the ending of Last Temptation of Christ, the moment where Jesus is on the cross and imagining his life if he were to not crucify himself. It reminded me of that, just the way it was done and the way it kind of had like this eerie feeling to it. That scene is another scene that really stood out to me in particular. So yeah, the movie is brilliant. It's just a beautifully made movie, a really compelling story, very fast paced, very emotional. It really has that kind of traditional Scorsese format, but it doesn't feel like it's tired or played out like other directors who use similar beats in their movies. This is what Gangs of New York wanted to be. When I watch Gangs of New York, I see like a good movie behind an ugly movie. Everything looked kind of cheap and murky in that movie, and I just remember it was so tonally inconsistent with Bill the Butcher, and it just didn't work, that movie. And this is the movie I think Scorsese wanted to make with Gangs of New York. I think if Gangs of New York went a little well, because it was a big passion project of his, if it went a little smoother, I feel like it would have been more similar to this movie. And as for the supporting cast in this movie, the supporting cast really elevates the movie. De Niro especially. De Niro's great in everything he does. He's so good at this fucking villainous piece of shit character that you just want to fucking punch in the face. He kind of has like this facade of being like this very charitable man, but meanwhile he's pulling strings behind the scenes. And you can see that like when they're gathered around trying to put a bounty on the head of the killer. And he's like, I'm gonna throw in $1,000. And like, yeah, you're the killer, dude. But also there's that scene where he turns himself into the police and he's like, what did I do? I don't know, but hey, handcuff me. I'm innocent. Like that scene, he plays it up so perfectly. He's such a hateable fucking piece of shit in this movie. And it was so fun to root against him. And then Lily Gladstone is the standout in here. She has a very nuanced performance, which is much required because DiCaprio and Robert De Niro are very over the top and chewing up scenery, so you kind of need that character to bring things down. Her like emotional journey in the movie is kind of the meat of the story, which is where I kind of have a problem with the movie. I'd praise the movie enough. I'm just going to talk about the negatives. Overall, in my Scorsese ranking, this is kind of mid-tier Scorsese. It's no Casino, Goodfellas, Wolf of Wall Street, Silence, Irishman, Last Temptation of Christ. Those movies I would put kind of above it. Nonetheless, like, it's a Scorsese movie. Is going to be great no matter what. I feel like the problem I had was how Lily Gladstone's character is kind of forgotten in the final hour. And she does have this really interesting and beautiful arc because she's the more spiritual character, whereas Robert De Niro's character is the more realistic, like planted in reality and just corrupted and money hungry and greedy. There's this really interesting moment in the third act where, despite everything that DiCaprio did, she is willing to forgive him at the cost of him just spilling everything out. She talks about a dream she had where she had a box full of DiCaprio's secrets and she was ready to just read all of them and just put them in the past. So she gave DiCaprio the okay to just divulge all the crimes that he did. And he divulges all but one, which was that he was poisoning her. And the fact that he didn't divulge everything is what upset her. Not the fact that this man basically murdered her whole family. That's not what pissed her off. Was more of the fact that he lied to her when she was really willing to put all that aside. I feel like to build up to kind of that emotional moment, I needed to spend more time with Lily Gladstone's character. And I think the perfect time to do that would have been in the final act where DiCaprio gets arrested. I feel like what was going on in the prison cell and behind the scenes, that wasn't as interesting as what could have happened if we just switched focus to Lily Gladstone's character and explore her recovery, her relationship with her family, her hesitating on whether she forgives DiCaprio or not. I think that would have been a much more interesting third act compared to the one we got. And the other problem I have in this movie is DiCaprio's performance. I'm not the biggest DiCaprio fan. I'll leave it at that. There's kind of like two collaborators that are really good with Scorsese. You have the De Niro films and you have the DiCaprio films. And I feel like whenever Scorsese is with DiCaprio, it's just not as compelling as when he's with De Niro. I'm just not the biggest DiCaprio fan in general, though. You know what he reminds me of? He reminds me of a kid who just snuck into his dad's closet and put a suit on and just started playing pretend. I never, buy him as an actor. There are a few roles where I think he kind of fits, like Django Unchained. But for the most part, I don't really buy DiCaprio when he does these very heady performances. He's more of a movie star to me than he is an actual actor. Because throughout the film, I felt like his performance was just a little too much. He does this thing with his mouth like this. And I'm like, you don't need to do that. It's a bit much. And I get what he was trying to go for. His character is going through this transformation where he starts off a bit more innocent and slowly gets corrupted and disgusting and rotten. And they kind of portray that with the fly symbolism, where there's always a fly around him, and he's in the third act, he's always slapping flies around him. Kind of reminded me, I think Last Temptation of Christ did that, but I might be mistaking it with Passion of the Christ. One of those movies had Judas with flies around him. Anyway, so I felt like his performance was just a bit too much. Also, there's a point in the movie where he finds out that his son died of whooping cough. He's just screaming, and I'm like, you don't need to do that. He's just doing God damn it! Shit! God damn it! And I was almost expecting him to be wah! 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 It was a bit too much. I wish this was a movie with a different actor. When I was watching this movie, I kept thinking of Sam Rockwell, because Sam Rockwell is really good at playing these ignorant people. I think of him as George W. Bush in Vice, and his character Dixon in 3 Billboards Outside of Ebbing, Missouri, where he's just a very aloof character. He's just really dumb. And That's kind of a problem in this movie because this is your protagonist. DiCaprio's your protagonist. Whenever he makes decisions out of just being plain dumb, it doesn't really make for a compelling character compared to a movie like Goodfellas, where it's also about a character who starts off innocent and slowly becomes corrupted. I kind of bought that more than just like, oh yeah, he does it because he's dumb. It kind of became like, okay, yeah, I kind of wanted a bit more there in terms of the character's motivation. But I kept thinking of Sam Rockwell. Like, if Sam Rockwell was in this role, he would have done a really good job at playing this very aloof, racist, kind of dumb character. But instead we get DiCaprio, who just doesn't quite nail that performance. I felt like there was something a bit off about his performance. I get what Scorsese was trying to do in terms of the character's motivation, because he's trying to say that ignorance leads to violence. People who are ignorant in the face of injustice are just as guilty as those who partake in it. I understand that kind of motivation. Just in terms of watching a movie, I felt like it was a little unsatisfying, and I was kind of just like, okay, this character is pure dumb. Like, he literally just signs his life away to Robert De Niro without him realizing what he's doing, and I'm like, okay, this guy is just dumb. And I felt like it was just played a bit too much, the whole dumb thing, where it was becoming like, this character is really hard to follow because, like, we're just using he's dumb as an excuse. I do, however, like that kind of inherent evil that lies within DiCaprio's character. Because when Lily Gladstone first sees him, she compares him to a coyote. When I think about a coyote, I think of a very sneaky, violent animal. There's always this kind of wolf symbolism that surrounds DiCaprio's character. So I like his kind of inherent evil in this character. But in terms of him just making moves because he's dumb, kind of made for something that was a little unsatisfying to me. There's a fine line you have to balance, because if you make him too sympathetic, critics are going to complain that they're making a overtly racist character sympathetic, like we saw in 3 Billboards Outside of Ebbing, Missouri. But I just feel like what was done in that movie was a lot more interesting than what was done in this kind of movie. Speaking of people complaining about the movie, there's a lot of people complaining about the portrayal of Native Americans. One in particular was a tweet by one of the stars of Reservation Dogs, where she just like roasted the movie. Listen, I live in Canada. I've seen my fair share of land acknowledgements. This is more effective than any land acknowledgement. This is a very powerful movie. And just seeing the overall general audience consensus, everyone's walking out of that movie feeling the utmost sympathy for Lily Gladstone's character, who ultimately isn't even a character. She's a real person. So to get like a large group of people collectively sharing sympathy for the life of a woman whose life was just disturbed by violence and racism, for a director to do that for a mass audience, I think this movie works absolutely perfectly when it comes to its mission. Scorsese was very captivated by this story, and he wants to find a way to tell this story in the most beautiful way possible so that people can really understand the struggle of Native Americans in the 1900s. It achieves what it's trying to do. I don't see how this is an offensive movie in any way. I think people are finding this movie offensive because Lily Gladstone's character is not as much in the forefront, but I do have that problem too, but only when it comes to like a narrative sense. I think it would have been more interesting to get her perspective in that final act. But in terms of creating sympathy and making you aware of the situation, I think this movie achieves what it wants to do with flying colors. This movie, it's growing on me. I will say that. When I first walked out of the theater, I was kind of annoyed by DiCaprio's performance and how aloof the character was. But as I let the movie ferment in me, I am gaining a much more bigger appreciation for the film. And I'm happy that Scorsese, this late in his career, is still able to fucking do home runs, man. This is one of the best movies of the year so far, and I hope you guys watch it. Go support it in theaters, and I'll see you guys around. Take care.